Germany, June 1921 to November 1923. Highest monthly inflation rate, over 30,000%. Time required for prices to double, every few days. During World War I, like many countries, Germany, then called the Weimar Republic, suspended its gold standard to fund the war effort, based on the belief that they were going to win the war and pay for it by plundering their enemies. That plan obviously didn't work out, so after the war, they were left shackled with not only their own war debts, but were also fined 132 billion gold marks in reparations by the Treaty of Versailles, the equivalent of about $269 billion today. The first payment of that war guilt came due in June 1921. The problem was the treaty didn't allow Germany to make payments in its own currency, so Germany had no choice but to exchange their German marks for other respected currencies at really bad exchange rates. So what was the solution? Well, we're off the gold standard, so let's just print more money. And print they did. That printed money was used to buy foreign currency, that foreign currency was used to pay off their war reparations, and soon Germany was buying foreign currency at any price because why not? All they had to do was print more money. So in just a little over a year later, the German mark was already practically worthless. A $50,000 bill turned into a $500,000 bill, to a $5 million bill, to a $50 million bill, to $500 million, to $5 billion, to $50 billion, to $500 billion, to $5 trillion, to a $50 trillion bill. Bills that were worth more of its weight as wood fire than as a medium of exchange. A loaf of bread that cost 160 marks by the end of 1922 skyrocketed to 200 billion marks just a year later.
For the decades leading up to 1971, the US experienced a ton of real massive growth. Workers went from making $675 a year, or $19,000 in today's money, to more than $56,000 in today's money by the late 60s. People enjoyed paid leave and sick days for the first time, they could pay off student loans, buy houses and cars, and enjoyed a financially stable life. Payroll increased by at least 32% in the 60s alone. Fiber optic cables, LEDs, weather satellites, the heart pacemaker, the internet, DRAM for computers, lasers were all invented in the 60s alone. The upper, middle, and lower classes were all moving up together in harmony. But then, 1971 hits, and something really weird happens. The economy kept growing, except it was no longer everyone getting richer together. Now it was only the rich getting richer, and the middle and lower class basically flatlined. To this day.
Even with globalization, even with the computer revolution, the internet revolution, the biotech revolution, it somehow has not added up to quite as much of a difference as people thought. And if you were in the mid-1960s, people thought it was going to be the Jetsons, you're going to have vacation trips on the moon and flying cars and robots doing all your work. And it hasn't quite happened. It's been just much slower.
Right. The only robot that does any work that I'm aware of is the Roomba little carpet sweeper.
There isn't as much progress happening as advertised, and that rather than racing towards utopia or dystopia, the much bigger problem is one of relative stagnation. It sort of manifests economically, and that for the first time we have a younger generation that's not clearly doing better than their parents.
Family incomes are up, some from the late 60s, but it's not clear that's the right metric, because you have a lot of families where both spouses are working, and that's very different from the world of the late 60s.
Okay.
And
The inflation rate skyrocketed from around 4% at the start of 1971 to more than double at 8.8% in 1973. By the end of the 70s, it would go up to 12%. Household debt exploded exponentially after 1971. So while lower and middle class income stayed stagnant, they were simultaneously getting shackled in debt. College tuition also suspiciously started skyrocketing after 1971. And ask yourself, how many new, real, physical, truly revolutionary technologies like LEDs or fiber optics have we really seen in the last few decades besides reusable rockets? Not much. Something happened. The rules of the game were changed. It was no longer a level playing field. And the best part is that it slipped right underneath the noses of the middle and lower class. And all the signs point back to this one year, 1971. It was the year that rearranged the very fabric of society as we know it. But to understand what happened, we have to take a journey all the way back to World War I. Before World War I hit, trade around the world was conducted on a very simple gold standard. Basically, whatever you wanted from another country, you would pay for in the required weight of gold. This meant that countries that had lots of stuff to export would have more gold than countries who didn't have a lot to export. And before World War I, the system worked pretty well. The governments around the world kinda got along perfectly, which meant trading with gold was simple and easy. But then World War I came around and threw the entire system on its head. The war brought a lot of infighting and disagreements between countries that used to work together. It put a lot of powerful countries in debt. They had to spend a lot of their gold buying weapons and equipment to fight against each other, and gold reserves started being spread around the world much more thinly. By the end of World War I, the US had a serious gold deficit, and once the Great Depression hit, this got even worse. So in 1930, the government pretty much forced Americans to exchange all the gold they had for dollars. They increased the price of gold from $20 an ounce to $35 an ounce, hoping that this would discourage Americans from buying gold in the future. This also meant that a lot of foreign countries suddenly got interested in trading their gold for dollars. Since they would be getting so much more money in exchange for their gold, almost every country that had a natural gold source traded it with the US for dollars. By 1939, there was enough gold in the world to replace all the money in circulation. Then World War II hit, and suddenly, the US was dipping into its gold reserves again. And if they thought World War I took a lot of money, World War II was even worse. The two wars had wrecked the global financial system, and the simple gold standard and government taxes just wasn't enough to fund the crazy spending the US had to do. Something had to change. Enter the Bretton Woods system.
At Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates from 44 allied and associate countries arrived for the opening of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. Invited by President Roosevelt to the first major world financial meeting since the London Conference of 1933, they will work in the seclusion of this White Mountains resort.
At the end of the war, the 40 biggest and most important governments in the world all came together at the Bretton Woods Hotel in New Hampshire to try to find a new financial standard that would be less likely to cause a global bankruptcy. The US had more than 75% of the world's gold, and the dollar was one of the only currencies still linked to the gold standard by then. So the countries agreed they would value their national currencies relative to the dollar's value in gold. It was basically a very indirect version of the gold standard that pinned the value of the dollar at $35 per ounce of gold. All the other countries of the world would adjust the value of their currency according to that. And for a while it worked. The US stockpiled its new gold from countries who wanted to trade in gold for dollars, and the Bretton Woods system became the new way to have a stable currency after a chaotic war. But all things must come to an end, and that end came in the year 1971. So by the late 40s and early 50s, the US had a new superpower, the ability to print as much money as it needed for whatever it wanted. It wasn't supposed to work like that. There was supposed to be a methodical decision-making process that kept the amount of dollars in the world equal to the amount of gold the US has stockpiled, but the temptation to print money was just too great. It was like giving a child the keys to a candy shop. Whenever there was a new national development, social program, or massive technological project, the US could just print the money it needed to pay for it. After all, dollars were as good as gold. With all this extra money, the economy obviously boomed, but it wasn't sustainable. By 1955, America went to war in Vietnam, and suddenly, it needed a lot more money than it had in gold. The Vietnam War carried on for 20 years and cost $168 billion, or around $1 trillion in today's money. To fund it, the government had to print money like crazy, and near the end, this reckless creation of new dollars finally caught up with it. You see, other countries started noticing that the US was printing way more money than it could possibly have in gold. So they got worried. What if the president suddenly announced that instead of $35 for an ounce of gold, it would be now $45 or $50? It would be the perfect way for the US to stay afloat, but it would mean countries like the UK and France would have to pay way more money to get their gold back. So the UK and France decided to quit while they were still ahead, and France sent a warship to New York to pick up their gold. It was 1971. And President Nixon was having none of it. So in one fell swoop, he declared a suspension of anyone's ability to convert dollars into gold.
I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
This short statement would become one of the most pivotal moments in history that hardly anyone knows the importance of. For the first time in modern history, the world's money was no longer tied to anything. For the first time, if you want to take people's wealth, if you want them to work for you as your indentured slaves, no longer did you have to do it at the point of a gun or through taxes, both of which breeds resentment. Now all you had to do was print more money. The more money you printed, the more of their wealth you stole from them without them ever even noticing it before it's too late. Because the dollar amount in their bank account stays the same, but the value of those dollars goes down. What started in 1971 was the greatest con and wealth redistribution scheme humanity has ever seen, and with it, the Bretton Woods system officially came to an end. The money printer was let loose, and the chaos that resulted was subtle, like boiling a frog. Immediately, the dollar's value dropped at least 50%. All that new money pushed up the prices of assets like real estate and stocks, which the rich own and the poor don't, furthering the divide. What used to take 30 hours of work to buy 1 unit of a publicly traded stock in 1860 would take at least 126 hours of work today. 1971 was also the year that the 30-year mortgage standard was introduced, which meant that where you could have bought a house for just 3 years' salary in 1950, you're in debt for the next 30 years today.
Instant money, M-O-N-E-Y, in the form of a convenient personal loan.
So household debt explodes exponentially, college tuition explodes exponentially, the number of lawyers quadrupled. And what did all that debt and divide mean for middle and low income families? Over half of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, even when they make more than $100,000 a year. Most Americans that can save have less than $5,000 in their savings accounts, and the income for the middle and lower classes has stayed nearly the same since 1971, while the upper class continues to climb. The modern pleb is a debt slave draped in Louis. And today, we might be witnessing the grand finale of the dollar. Almost a year ago, I made a video on how 40% of US dollars were printed in the year 2020.
So you're talking about a $6.2 trillion bill, and this will deliver urgently needed relief to our nation's families, workers, and businesses. And that's what this is all about. And it got a 96-0. But I want to thank Republicans and Democrats for coming together, setting aside their differences, and putting America first. All right, thank you all. Good, I wanted that to be a nice signature. That was
Today, the Federal Reserve has updated those numbers, and I redid the math. It's no longer 40% of all US dollars were printed since 2020, not 50%, not even 70%. Nope, since January 2020, the US has printed nearly 80% of all US dollars in existence. 80%! M1. I literally had to do a double take when I saw this number. But yes, at the start of 2020, there was $4 trillion in circulation. And in October 2021, there's over $20 trillion in circulation. That means, ladies and gentlemen, that the government has so far robbed 80% of your wealth in the span of under 2 years. And although you may only feel this theft in higher gas prices and such so far, it's probably gonna get a lot worse.
Good night, folks. God bless each and every single one of you. Good night, Pooh, my darling sweetheart. Good night, Allison. You vibrant little bundle of joy. You know, this house is haunted. I can hear you girls screaming and playing all the time. Annie, you're the love of my life. You always will be the love of my life. And I miss you. I miss you all terribly, terribly much.